I can't remember who said it. I did hear Barack Obama say this. He said, it's hard to believe that you can be something that you can't see. And I think that's so true. And that's why role models are so important. And that's why I'm out there doing this kind of work. That's why I volunteer and I advocate. My name is Ginger Chien. My pronouns are she and her. I am a transgender woman in tech, currently live just outside of Seattle, which is where I was born and raised. I've always lived in Seattle. I was born and raised here. I did have the opportunity to travel to the East Coast and spend a couple of years there going to school, but I always had this yearning to come back to Seattle. And I think that's where I find my roots, the roots that I have with the mountains and the forests and the water and everything else that's here, as well as my family and Chinese community roots as well. My family is originally from China. They fled China after World War II because they were amongst the educated class, and it wasn't safe for them to stay in China after World War II. Moved to Taiwan, and after Taiwan, moved here, along with a wave of very hopeful immigrants with big visions and big ideas about what they wanted for their kids in the US. I think there's a lot of unknown history in every family. I was digging around and I found one of the patriotic songs that my grandfather wrote as a political officer in the nationalist Chinese party at the time. So those are kind of entertaining, but they also tell me how deep some of those roots of family and country run. And in an interesting way, I don't see it as being all that different in terms of the LGBTQ experience of people in other families. There are really deep traditions of family and religion and culture and country that run through everybody. In a way, I think a lot of our struggles are very similar. One of the common threads I see across families and cultures is that parents pretty universally have a vision of who they want to see their children become. And it's not always what the children have in mind for themselves. And the children often don't even have a clear picture for quite a while. The details will differ. In my family's traditions, I was successful if I could claim the title of a doctor or a lawyer or a concert musician. And it turned out being an engineer was okay. My dad ended up being a mathematician / engineer. And so it was certainly a respected profession amongst my family's circle of immigrant friends. And then if you turn to any other family or any other culture, you'll see similar expectations. Maybe the specific professions will differ, but the expectations, I think, are just as high. My father has passed away. My mother still lives very close, and I am close to my mom, close to my one and only sibling, an older sister, and to my daughter as well. And I'm really glad that they're all nearby. It makes certain things just feel a lot more personal. I think that knowledge helps given today's conditions where we are still physically separate. But it's nice to know that they're nearby, that mom can call me for computer help, and I can call upon her if I need help translating something, like, or understanding a little bit about the history of the paintings that hang on the wall behind me that used to be hanging in her place. I can say a little bit about my father in that there was a very complex coming out story there, because he suffered from a brain disease that slowly took his cognition and his ability to speak. It was never really clear to me how much he understood about my coming out process at the time that it was happening. And if there was one thing that I wish I could have done differently, was to have been able to reach him and explore these ideas with him before it became impossible to communicate with him. You'll hear this thread of both joy and regret as I talk about my life. And that's one of the little stories that forms part of that picture. I like to peg my own personal self-awareness, probably at the age of 3, because I remember asking my earliest playmates and asking my mom and my sister about the toys and the friends and the clothes. And I remember asking about that stuff before I cared about almost anything else. And then the actual coming out didn't happen for a couple decades, because when I grew up, it was the 60s. And it was still pretty old school thinking back then. There wasn't much room for ideas about gender and orientation. And so I ended up closeting myself pretty deeply for a long time, until about age 40. And that's when I finally began to crack open some doors, because most of my responsibilities, most of my fears about losing everything, whether it was schoolmates or college opportunities or my first job or my wife, a lot of those fears about loss were slowly disappearing off my table. And then I had to ask myself the question, well, what does all of this mean to me? And I wasn't able to deflect with some of those other complications. Then around 50 was when I officially came out, after spending many years exploring my identity in public with new friends, as a musician. There were lots of things I did that finally gave me the confidence to officially transition, at least with family and work. My interest in STEAM probably started at a really young age. I remember my parents buying me what they thought were gender appropriate toys. And that meant Lego, that meant Tinker Toys, erector sets. I'm trying to think what else. I think they tried chemistry sets. For some reason, chemistry just didn't quite do it for me. I ended up doing some really stupid and dangerous things on my own with fireworks later. So there's always been this curiosity I have in manipulating things. And I don't know, maybe that was a reflection of how I felt a lack of control over being able to manipulate my environment in other ways that were more meaningful to me. But at least I was able to manipulate the things. So I had lots of encouragement that wasn't necessarily given to girls. My sister grew up with Barbie, and I grew up with Lego. And that's just the way it was back then. In later years, I began to discover electricity, which would lead to my eventual landing in the field of electrical engineering. My first dabblings in electrical theory would have been with the various flashlights that I took apart. And in hindsight, I think I understood that flashlights were this wonderful microcosm of everything that engineering is, because it has to have usability. It has to be easy to carry. It has to have brightness and beams that are useful, and it can't run out of energy too soon. It's all of the trade-offs that any good engineer has to deal with in this one little package. And I remember goofing around with batteries and light bulbs and discovering very quickly that a 9-volt battery and a little tiny red Christmas tree bulb were a great way to light up my toys so that I could drive them around or fly them around at night. And so there was a lot of messing around with electronics, and an old Radio Shack build-it-yourself electronics kit was a big part of that. That probably would have been around late grade school, and pretty much every toy that I had that broke, I would take apart. And so that meant there was a slot car racing set that I have, the little electric powered cars that race around on a track. And I eventually crashed the cars and the bodies broke and the wheels fell off, but the motors were still good. And so I was able to connect the motors to different things. And at one point, probably around sixth grade, after having watched some documentaries about hovercraft, I took a motor and I took a tin can lid, cut a fan blade out of that, attached it to the motor, stuck a battery on it, built a paper cardboard hovercraft with skirts to catch the air. And this thing was actually floating around on the kitchen floor and terrifying my dog, but it worked. It really worked. It was a hovercraft and it worked. And I'm surprised I didn't amputate a finger, because it was just a piece of cut tin can that was spinning very fast. But boy, I think there's so much to be learned from being fearless about experimentation. Even just a couple months ago, I had a toaster oven that died. And there's so much raw metal that can be recycled, if nothing else. I just started taking that thing apart. And there's a lot of hindsight that I gained in how engineers designed this very popular, very cheap toaster oven that millions of people own. And what was done to make it functional and cheap, make it so it just didn't fall apart too quickly, but was still easy to assemble. There's like I said, there's so much to be learned by taking stuff apart, and some of that comes back in a way that I can fix things unexpectedly as well. My interest in taking things apart and putting things back together, that was really me, because my sister is 8 years older than me. And so there's a big age separation. There wasn't much that we did together. And we were raised in a way that our interests were completely different. I didn't have all that many playmates at a really young age. And I spent a lot of time just doing things on my own, hanging out in the woods by myself, climbing fir trees and communing with the crows up there. There was a lot of stuff that I did very quietly on my own. I built models, and there was a paper airplane book called the Great International Paper Airplane Book. And it had the winning designs from this annual competition of paper airplane designers. And I probably made every plane in that book 50 times, trying to figure out what it was that made each one a winner. And again, some win on distance, some win on aesthetics, some win on acrobatics. And they all have their strong points and their weak points. There was a lot of time just spent on my own exploring these things. That was kind of my introverted nature, I think, because, like I said, I did learn pretty early that some of the interests I had in the more social play were things that my friends weren't receptive to. It's not book learning that I'm talking about. I know craftspeople and tradespeople, they've never been to college, and yet everything that they know, the artistry and the wisdom of everything they've learned through their apprenticeships or through working with a mentor, they've picked that up without the benefit of traditional education. And some of my skills, they pale in comparison to these people who don't have that traditional structured education. And I will vouch for their experience and what they've picked up just through discovery and making mistakes. I'll vouch for their skills far faster than I will vouch for the ones that I've picked up along the way with far less exposure than they will ever have. I think we each have a lifetime of lessons and exposures, often to the specifics of our situation. But I just see that as so valuable because there's no way I can ever recreate that for myself. It would take another lifetime. And so I really respect what people have gathered, their efforts at specifically learning skills. It all takes time and dedication that I won't be able to repeat. And so I see it and I value it in others. 30 or 40 years ago, when the US was concerned about Japan's rise in the business and technology space, one of the things that the US took comfort in is that Japanese students were very regimented in how they learned, and that there wasn't creativity and freedom. And in a way, I think we lost sight of that here. We lost sight of the value of that creativity and freedom. We ended up falling into our own rut as far as what we considered essential for being effective as an engineer. And we're rediscovering that. One of the things I love seeing in the industry these days is the increased interest in non-traditional skills. So bringing an art major into an innovation, a technology innovation role, or bringing someone who has perhaps one of the people I remember meeting at work was a cheerleading coach. And there's a very unique kind of human dynamic that's necessary to be a cheerleading coach. And that can be very effective in a workplace, whether you're talking about people or whether you're talking about coordinating systems, right? And one of the topics that I like talking about is how we as queer people might be really well positioned to be some of the breakthrough innovators that the industry needs. And it requires that we see that we break out of our own boxes. And so let me explain what I mean by that. One of the things about patents that's really interesting is there are a set of strict rules, legal tests for what is patentable. And then we also have, on the business side of things, what are the things that make an idea successful in business? So on the business side, you might have, well, it needs to make money. It needs to be popular. It needs to be something we can make right now and start selling. On the patent side, the three legal tests are, it has to have some conceivable utility, but it doesn't have to be useful. It has to be something that's non-obvious to an expert. And it has to be novel. It has to be creative in some way. The thing about patents is they do not have to be marketable. They do not have to be profitable. They don't even have to be socially acceptable, but they meet the tests for a patent, which is those other legal tests. And so one of the things I try to tell people to do is to think about the rules that we use in the business world as applicable to the business world, those that you use in coming up with patents. It's a different set of rules. It's great if they can overlap. If you can nail all the patent requirements and the business requirements at the same time, then you've got a really strong idea. Some patents are simply ahead of their time. They can have value, but not for a few years. Or in the case of Hedy Lamarr, she was the one, along with her Hollywood composer friend, who came up with the invention for spread spectrum and frequency hopping radios as a way to make torpedoes resistant to enemy jamming signals and make a torpedo controllable by radio. Because until then, they were all fire and cross your fingers. She came up with that patent. It's in her name, but the technology was just a little bit ahead of its time. No one was able to build it. And there was also some rumor that no one wanted to build something that was invented by a movie star and a composer. So there are human issues at play in the technology space still. But I think it's important to remember that if you can think back on your queerness and how it has given you perspectives about gender structures, about social conventions, about what it is that people think they value and what they are forced into thinking they value. Queer people have a unique ability to see through that stuff that a lot of people never get challenged to think about. And I think queer people are already very versed in living outside of boxes. We're pretty good at putting ourselves in boxes, jumping to another box, jumping out to a different place. And we have insights and perspectives that the average person might not ever see. And there are ways to leverage that in a creative sense that can make certain inventions or certain ideas or position a data structure that you're building for software on day one in a place where it's going to be ready for new needs on day 500 that most other people would never have thought about. I did my undergraduate study at the University of Washington. It was close to home, really affordable, which is wonderful. And I entered college not quite knowing exactly what degree I would be pursuing. And for me, it was actually between engineering, probably electrical engineering, and architecture. And the architecture part really spoke to me because of the artistic side. And there's plenty of engineering in architecture. There's a lot of engineering. In fact, perhaps a more important intuitive understanding of engineering that's necessary in architecture than might be grasped by a typical engineer. But I ended up going into electrical engineering because it was the most practical and likely to be economically rewarding discipline at the time. And I've had to recognize that the artistic interests and the creative interests that I had walked away from in architecture, they kind of came back and have found me again in recent years as I pursue other artistic endeavors. So after I graduated from the University of Washington, I, like many of my other peers, were faced with the decision of, well, do I go to work or do I continue on with school? And to be honest, I didn't felt like I knew anything that had made me ready for work. And so I decided to continue with what I knew, and I had the opportunity to go to grad school. So I went to grad school in Princeton for a year and got a master's in electrical engineering there, and decided at that point that the PhD didn't really fit my interests. That was just committing too much time, too much focus into a purely academic direction. And I wanted to, at that point, get out of school. So I ended up looking around, and I found a consulting engineering firm that happened to be back near my hometown in Washington State. So I started working there. My very first job, interestingly enough, was as an electrical engineer working on electromagnetic and electrical simulations of what happens to electronics in the presence of a nuclear bomb blast. So it's something that you see in science fiction movies all the time these days, right? Electromagnetic pulse, and the bomb goes off and all the electronics die. And that's exactly what I was working on. In hindsight, while it was really fascinating work, it wasn't until a few years later that my questions of ethics and my questions of engineering purpose came up again. And to be honest, I'd kind of forgotten my lessons about the flashlight and that engineering exists by and for and to help people. And I decided, no, I don't think I want to do this military related work anymore, as interesting as it was. But I decided I wanted to get into something that was a little more directly connected with people. And so I ended up in communications technology, which eventually led me into IT systems and various types of wireless communications and landed me where I am right now at AT&T. My transition process at work is probably best summarized as one of intense caution, because I work in a pretty esoteric field. Uh, Cell phone engineers, there's not tons of us around, and there aren't all that many companies to work for either. And so I was always worried. It was just an extension of that childhood story of being afraid of losing it all if I were to come out. And honestly, I found that reasoning at every point in my life. There was always this fear of losing it all. So something shifted for me, which led to me making a decision to transition. And I think what shifted was not so much that the world or the workplace was radically changing for the better, although it has been changing for the better. It was more that the world, I could see that there was a place for me and that the risk had become worth taking. That's really what it came down to. And a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction in myself about not being able to realize myself. Those were mounting on one side. Things weren't getting worse. They were slowly getting better in the workplace side. So I made that decision to begin approaching people at work. Now, everybody does this differently. I had the advantage of kind of socially transitioning outside of work. I had spent 10 years developing an identity and a new circle of friends, spending time with a gender-friendly social club where we would go do things and go see plays and go see movies and take boat trips together, go to restaurants. And I also had joined my band at that time. So I was performing as well. All of this in my ginger persona. So I had already become familiar with, well, what's it like to have friends as a woman? And what's it like to be treated like a person who knows nothing at the hardware store when I totally understand everything in the electrical section of the store. So I've experienced a lot of that, and in the end, it was me doing the engineer thing. I had the chance to compare the previous life that I knew to the new life that I was building. I did that A/B experiment, and I could clearly say that I like B a lot better. And in fact, that was part of my coming out story when I announced to my entire team at work. I said, I've done the A/B experiment. And they all go, oh, yeah. So they could understand that. And at the same time, I understand a lot of people don't have that luxury of being able to conduct the side-by-side experiments. For a lot of people, it's something that you have to do, and it's the only path you've got. I don't have any experience to share there other than I just did it very carefully. That's my nature, to be really cautious. And that caution cost me time. And I sometimes think back, well, yeah, sure, I could have done things faster and more recklessly and with much more abandon. And I don't know what the outcome would have been. I would have probably saved time, but I honestly don't know what it would have been. So there's a lot to be said for doing what feels true and to rush at a slow and deliberate speed, if that means anything at all. But these were the words of wisdom on the whiteboard at a gender support center. Just rush slowly and be thoughtful about it. So the coming out process at work was one where I had to make a decision. Do I tell my manager first, or do I tell HR first? And again, it'll be different for everybody because it depends on what kind of team you're working with and what kind of manager you have. And I just chose to talk to HR first because within my company, I knew that they had top tier HRC ratings. I knew that the policies were in place. And for me, someone who thinks about the power of institutions, the power of government, the power of the judicial system, the power of the school system to make life really good or really bad for queer people. The fact that there is a form at a workplace which says reason for gender change, preferred new name, that means someone in the legal department has said, sure, this is good, we'll stand by it. And there's a lot of power in this otherwise bland looking HR form that gave me a lot of comfort. So that was a big part of my process, was finding the safety I needed, because in my small field, I honestly didn't know what would happen to me. The coming out process was a shock to my coworkers, but I have to say, to their credit, they're well educated, they're intelligent. We had spent the last 15 years working together in a pretty tight team, so we knew each other fairly well. There's a lot of respect, and I think that goes a long way. There's a lot of maturity as well. And the way I did it was I arranged with HR and my manager that on the day of the announcement in our team meeting, I would leave work for a week and work from home. That was the time for everyone to talk things over, to check in with the manager if they had questions, to talk to me offline if they really wanted to. And then I would come back, and I came back at a company picnic on neutral ground at a park. So you can see that I was thinking this through very, very carefully. Neutral ground is an important concept for certain stressful situations. And as far as I could tell, that process went really well. One of the things that told me it went really well was what happened afterwards and how people came up to me later. I had already arranged with management that at the moment that I made my personal announcement, that a dozen emails would go out to senior managers all across the company that I work with. And it was a very straightforward, matter-of-fact email. It was that I would be transitioning, that I would continue to do the same work that I did, and that everybody was expected to continue our working arrangements in a professional fashion. That was it. And I think there's a lot to be said for, this is the expectation that we as an organization have for our people. Very simple. There were a few people who caught me in the hallway afterwards to share some thoughts with me. And I have to say they were all positive. There was not anything negative that anyone had to share. And I think if there was, in the back of their minds, I think the culture of our company is one of professionalism and respect, and it would never have been anything they would have tried to do. But the anecdotes that I love the most are, after I had come out for like maybe a week or two, someone said, I like the new you better, which I think is really interesting because it tells me how how unpleasant or how uninteresting I was as the closeted person that they knew. Another comment I heard was, I wish I had your courage. And I don't know what this person was going through, but there was something about seeing me and me finding myself in this unintentional role model position that showed them what was possible with courage, and that they wish they had it. They wish there was something in their life that they could change. I don't know whatever became of that. I hope that they may have been inspired to try something or to change their situation. But that's one of those mysteries about the way that our spirit touches others. A lot of it is something that they aren't ready to share yet. But my hope is that they've been affected in some way. that it leads to something better for them in the future. And the last anecdote was a fun one. A woman came up to me and said, "Damn you, your nail polish is raising the bar for the rest of us." And that was a sign that, at least in one sense, I had been accepted and taken in by the community of women at my workplace. I haven't heard anything like that since, for the whole last year, of course, because we haven't been around each other. But I do make it a point that I'm the one who dresses a little bit differently. I'm the one who rides the baby blue cruiser bicycle to work in a sundress. I'm doing things a little bit differently than most people, and it's just part of the package of who I am, and it's part of what one of our employee group, our LGBTQ employee group leaders told me, which was that every person that he's seen come out at work blossoms in amazing ways. And when he first told me that, of course, I wasn't ready to believe it, but now I totally understand what he was talking about. The coming out process changed a lot of the things that I do, and I would say pretty universally for the better. The raw technical work that I do is still about the same. So I still do the analysis, I still write the reports, I still do engineering advisories to different teams around the company. All of that work remains the same. What has really changed, though, and it goes hand in hand with a company that is seeking to diversify its employee base, to expand creative manners of thinking and engineering problems. What has changed is that I have fallen into a place where my role at the company is now a combination of teacher, I suppose, coach and inspirer, as well as as well as an engineer. And the crossover, naturally, is that I'm trying to do this kind of authenticity advocacy and these creative self-discovery exercises and emotional intelligence and awareness work. I'm doing all of this in the context of helping people break out of their traditional engineering shells. And I think if I can do that, then I will make them more effective engineers, perhaps more effective in how they work with other people. And it meets the larger goal of a lot of better companies these days that are trying to strengthen the fabric that connects employees, that fabric consisting of identities and experiences and visible things like ethnicity, invisible things like disabilities that may not be seen. All of these things are working towards that larger goal of belonging, giving people a sense of belonging, which is the next big frontier after businesses having spent a couple decades in the diversity and inclusion space. And I think that those words have lost some of their steam. No pun intended. I think it's lost some of its energy. And the introduction of the term belonging, I think is a really useful shift, because it looks more to how empathetic am I to the experience of others in my workplace? And am I stepping up to what makes them feel like they're really valued here? Not that I decide that if I think they're valued, but that I reach out and try to understand if they feel they're being valued by me. It's a completely different mindset. And I think a lot of the emotional intelligence work, even the speech crafting and storytelling education that I do, both inside and outside the company with engineering groups, all of that is part of that thread to tie together people in the engineering enterprise. And I think those connections between people in engineering are far more important than they used to be. If I were to think back a couple centuries, engineering may have been as much as turning screws or putting parts together in a skillful way and just building something. And that may have only really needed skilled labor. But engineering today is far more about information and knowledge exchange than it is about physical labor or crafting a high tolerance part that machines do very well. So my analogy is that the engineering workplace today is like a brain full of brain cells. Each of us does our thing, each of us has our knowledge, each of us is trying to sustain those connections with the brain cells around us. And if we can do that well, if we're frank with our coworkers and honest and trusting and accepting, then those connections open up really wide and we can be really effective at working with our peers. And if they close down, then you have the equivalent of a brain injury. And I can see how dysfunctional a brain gets when even a small number of connections get cut off. So in my thinking, my goal is to build as many new connections as possible, connections at the emotional level, at the relationship level, at the storytelling level, in addition to the usual slide decks and reports that we generate. I think the more connections we can open, especially the emotional ones, because it's the emotional connections that will last for years. And the facts will often fade within seconds. And if you're going to believe the facts, you still need trust in someone anyways. So that's my philosophy to bringing together all of these non-traditional engineering skills into the engineering space, because it makes the entire engineering organization composed of individuals more effective at working together.
Invest and prioritize yourself. Your education is valuable, your career is valuable, but so are you and your health.